Before we get started, I'm going to do a very brief intro about Dr. William Janousek. So over the last decade, Dr. Will Janousek has investigated many of the issues wildlife faces in modern times. From the intersection of disease ecology and conservation to the impacts of energy development and military operations on endangered species. His PhD research focused on the impacts of forest disturbance such as fire and bark beetle outbreaks on songbird communities throughout the greater Rocky Mountain region. In 2017, Will completed the Doctorate Research Fellowship Program with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at Seviera National Wildlife Refuge in New Mexico, where he developed critical habitat monitoring for the Rio Grande silvery minnow and the southwestern willow flycatcher. Currently, Will works as a biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, assessing the population status of the western bumblebee across North America, as well as modeling contact rates between elk on the National Elk Refuge to inform chronic wasting disease prevention. Again, thank you all for joining us this evening, and I'm going to turn the Zoom over to Will now and monitor the chat for questions. Will, go ahead and take it away.
Great, thanks for that introduction. I'm gonna switch screens here. Does that look good?
Yeah, it looks great.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for coming. Today, we're gonna talk a little bit about bumblebees and some of the research we've been doing at the U.S. Geological Survey here out of the Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center. I'm up in Montana. I work out of Glacier National Park, it's a primary office, and I live in Missoula. And so I'm going to be talking about the western bumblebee, which is a species that was once very widespread and common across Western North America and now has faced some tough years and is in decline. We'll talk about the reasons why that might be the case and explore some outcomes for the future. So I wanted to start first, though, looking backwards in time, give a little history lesson, and talk a little bit about pollinator conservation. So I'm sure folks are aware, but maybe some not, that Richard Nixon back in the 70s put into place the Endangered Species Act, which really established a nice benchmark for conservation moving forward to identify threatened endangered species and to figure out ways in which we can maintain the persistence of those species into the future. He also started the EPA, little factoid. And so shortly after that, shortly after the Endangered Species Act came into law, we had the first insect, which was a butterfly. The Schaus swallowtail butterfly was listed in 1976. This is a species that lives in the Florida Keys and still persists to this day. Moving forward a couple of years, another 20 or 30 years now, we get in the 90s. We've had a lot of species be added to the endangered species list, but only about 3% of those animals are insects. And I titled this talk with the term silent alarms because often, we have these smaller species that are, I think, maybe less charismatic or overlooked. They don't get as much attention, but biologists study them, right? And so beginning in the 90s and in the early 2000s, we start to see note large-scale declines across multiple different types of pollinators. Bumblebees in particular is what we're talking about today. And we see these both in Europe, but also in North America. And the discussions start to get going about focusing on pollinators more heavily. The first bee species was listed on the Endangered Species Act, the Hawaiian yellow-faced bee from Hawaii, 2016. And then shortly after that, the rusty patch bumblebee was listed. So now we're at a spot where we're starting to gain a little traction in terms of focus on these smaller pollinators. 2021, we have another species that was listed. This is called the Franklin's bumblebee. This species probably extinct. It's still searching for it in where it was last recorded, Oregon, Northern California, but it hasn't been seen for about a decade. And now we're going into the future, thinking about how we address the conservation needs of other species that might be declining. So I wanted to outline a little bit more of the bumblebees and bumblebee conservation across the country here. Here's our beautiful country. And I mentioned the rusty patch bumblebee. This species kind of occurs in the Great Lakes region, if you will. That one's been listed under the Endangered Species Act. And then Franklin's bumblebee out on the West Coast. Now we have several other species that have been petitioned for listing or are in there what we refer to as their pre-listing status. These are species that have warranted a closer look and are being considered for listing under the Endangered Species Act. So what we're going to be talking about today is the Western bumblebee. This species occurred across all of Western North America, but there's several others. The American bumblebee, also up in the Northeast Great Lakes region, yellow banded bumblebee, Rogers bumblebee down in the Southwest. And then interestingly, I think two species that are interesting are these two species of cuckoo bees. Now these bees don't act like normal bumblebees where they create a nest and have their own offspring. They tend to sneak into other bees' nests underground and lay their own eggs there, and then have those other species take care and grow those offspring. Often if you're familiar with birds, the cuckoos in Europe do the same thing. They lay their eggs in other birds' nests. So that's where that name comes from. So we're looking now at a quite advancement in the number of species that have been petitioned or considered for listing. And the reason for this is these species are facing a variety of different threats. One of the major threats that has been impacting bumblebees across the country are pathogens, and one pathogen in particular, and that is referred to as Nosema bombii or bombi. It's a parasitic fungus. These are on the right here are the spores of that fungus, and what happens is it will replicate and fill up the I guess we could refer to these as the lungs or the pathways inside the bumblebees that excrete waste, kind of like your kidneys, and that can cause mortality in those species. And so in the early 90s, we started to see large amounts of this pathogen, this fungus, in captive reared bumblebees that were used for pollination on farms and were spread around the country for pollinating crops. Subsequently, that spread to wild bees, and there's been a lot of study done to correlate that transition and indicates pretty clearly that this fungus had a big impact on beginning the declines of bumblebees in the mid-90s and the early 2000s. But moving forward, we have other threats that are kind of coinciding and coming in on the tail of these major pathogen threats. One being pesticides. I think many people are aware of the impacts of pesticides on crops and how that can influence the survival of native pollinators. We'll talk a little bit more about pesticides here in the slides. The next piece is habitat loss and habitat degradation. So it's both important that we are protecting, right, native habitat, but the quality of that habitat is important. For pollinators, they need floral resources or flowers, often coming in the form of forbs and sometimes woody shrubs that produce flowers. And so the quantity of those matters as well for the persistence of bumblebees and pollinators generally. And then, of course, the big elephant in the room is climate change and how changes in precipitation and temperature and the interaction of those, which can create drought, how that can influence the persistence of species into the future. So pollinators, much like many other wildlife and humans, are facing these different threats as we progress in the century. But really what we're talking about, the threats of bumblebees, but what's the value? Like, why should we care about bumblebees or pollinators more generally? And so I mentioned forbs. So forbs are really important for the functioning of ecosystems. Those flowering plants help provide food resources for a lot of other wildlife, including humans. Bears require berries in the fall and the spring, even in the summer and the fall, and they eat certain forbs in the spring. There's been studies that show that elk, their diet makes up about 80% of forbs. So forbs have a huge impact across wildlife, and they're really important from a bee perspective, and that interaction there helps maintain the functioning of ecosystems. And then from a purely economic standpoint for us, native pollinators as a group, so including bumblebees, provide what we refer to as economic services or ecosystem services to an economic benefit of about $1.5 billion a year that would otherwise need to be spent on growing and maintaining pollinators that you would then use to pollinate crops. So instead of having to do that, we can rely on native pollinators for that resource. That's just in the US. Now we start thinking about global terms and we get that number grows substantially. So we're talking about more specifically about the Western bumblebee today. And this is a photo of one in flight. The scientific name is Bombus occidentalis. Occidentalis, if you remember your Latin schooling, is referring to coming from the west or westerly, so very aptly named as the Western bumblebee. Characteristic of this species is this white tip on the abdomen. Fairly distinct most of the time, but it does vary spatially. And so I'll show you some other pictures of what the species looks like. Here it is flying to an aster to pollinate. So this species grows or lives in a variety of habitats, once ranging from southern New Mexico, Arizona, all the way up to Alaska, and then from Kansas, Nebraska plains to the coastal states, California, Oregon, and Washington. And it occurs across a variety of habitats. It's really a generalist species. We found widespread forests to shrublands to prairies. Sometimes you'll see it. Here's one on goldenrod, not as distinct of a white, but the patterning helps distinguish that. Depending on the lighting and the angle, it might be more yellow. Again, it does vary spatially across the country. You'll see different populations with slightly different color morphs. This one, a bit more white there, a bit more distinct. So this was really a generalist species occurring across a variety of habitats, and that's what allowed it to be so historically widespread. One interesting component to this story is that this species, based on some recent genetic evidence, has been split into two species along the north-south gradient. So this is a range map showing sort of where we would expect to see these two, what were once subspecies and are now species. We're focusing on the southern one, Bombus occidentalis, and the northern one that exists from mid British Columbia and north, that's Bombus mackay or Mackay's bumblebee. So we're focused our study and our effort on understanding the population trends and trajectories and causes of declines in the lower 48, which is Bombus occidentalis. I should say the genetic evidence suggests the split occurred about 20,000 years ago, which is pretty interesting and distinct, and I think fairly strong evidence that these are those two species there. So we conducted, myself and colleagues, a whole lot of collaborators, took a kind of first look at Western bumblebee. And, we've had evidence from a variety of different projects across the Western US of declines, but there wasn't one large consensus study that looked at the range-wide trends for this species. And so we wanted to first understand, could we detect any trends in this species with the data that's available? There aren't, they're not that easy to observe. You have to conduct surveys, right? And so we're amassing data from a bunch of different sources to try to make inference about the population as a whole. Rather than relying on single location studies, we wanted to look across the range. And so this paper came out in 2020. This was our first look at the declines in this species. We were looking at 1998 to 2020, and we found those large declines across the range that were noted and observed at more localized studies. I've circled New Mexico here just to put that in a little bit of reference. The gray bars are the historical occupancy, and the purple or pink are the current or 2018 occupancy, which is on the y-axis here. So occupancy, I just want to touch base on what that means. So really, you can think about it in terms of like commonness. So an occupancy of 0 would mean absence, and an occupancy of 1 would mean absolute presence or high confidence of presence. These are probabilities. So the larger the value, the more likely the species is present. We'll use occupancy in later slides. So I just wanted to cover that. But again, we see these declines across the range, depending on what state we look at. And in some places, the declines are a higher proportion of their historic value. So that's discouraging, right? It also is confirming of what localized studies were showing across the species range. But importantly, this was a very preliminary, quick look at what data was available, where were the information gaps, because that was something we were interested in, is kind of how do we fill some places in this country that didn't have data yet. So we built a team to kind of work out where those areas were and help collect data. And then the next stages, though, are really to think about what would be driving those declines. And that's the important component to this study, is that we didn't model those mechanisms of change, which are really important when we want to understand how to conserve a species moving forward. So that's what we're doing now, and that's what the rest of this talk is going to be about, is understanding some of those mechanisms for change. And actually, I'll just want to mention, I did get out in the field and was able to survey and found 2 individuals of Western bumblebee. This is one of those that we caught and took a photo of and let go. So to understand the mechanisms of change, it's important to start to think about the biology of the species, the life history, if you will, and how different threats or forces could interact across the species life cycle. So I wanted to talk about that briefly. And I did see that you had a talk the other month that mentioned this exact same bumblebee from somebody from the Xerces Society, but I find it really fascinating, the bumblebee life cycle. So we'll just cover that. So in the spring, queens emerge from their hibernation place underground. They emerge and they start to look for a suitable nest site. That's here. We're starting at 1 and we're moving clockwise around the figure. So after those queens emerge and they find a nest, they start to create wax pot. So they store their nectar and pollen. They begin to lay eggs. Those worker class, those daughters, those emerge and start to forage around. The colony grows. This is now beginning late spring, early summer. And then toward midsummer, the queens start to produce new males, and then new queens, which mate with those males. And then everyone else dies, and those new queens go and find spots to overwinter, starting in the fall. And so that's really fascinating, because when you start to think about threats that can influence a species, when only the queens are what's surviving over the winter, any sort of change that can influence that overwinter survival, or the survival in the spring of the queens, can be really detrimental and impactful to the species. And so we're coming at this from the perspective of this whole life cycle and thinking about where could different stressors influence survivability throughout these stages. And so I'm going to talk mainly about 2 potential types of stressors. The first one being temperature. And so temperature can influence a lot of different things. One, floral resources. So the amount and quality of flowers on the landscape can be influenced, and bloom timing. It's warmer in the spring, you might get earlier blooms, which could be out of sync for when bees are emerging. But temperature also has a big influence on the thermal tolerance of species. How hot it gets can really impact survivability during the summer. And you see a bunch of different ways to measure temperature here. I'm not going to read out all of them, but we thought about measuring temperature in a variety of ways across the life cycle throughout the season for a species. So we were looking both at warming events during the wintertime, what could happen in the spring, not just warm days in the spring, but frost days or cold days in the spring that could kill off early flowers. We also looked at heat waves and temperature during the summertime, comparing both maximum temperature now to what it was historically. So we really were placing different measures of temperature throughout the life cycle to kind of get a comprehensive understanding of what types of temperature, what methods of temperature could be influencing or could be acting as a potential stressor. We did the same thing for drought and precipitation. So here we're looking at not just the amount of rainfall, both in the winter, but also winter and spring, then in isolation, but also together, and then drought. And when we're talking about drought and precipitation, we're focused most heavily on floral resources because flowers, plants need water to grow and survive. So that's a big portion of that. So we looked at measures of drought, how long droughts take place, how severe those droughts are. The main focus with precipitation drought is on those flowering resources, but it is important to note that once colonies start to grow and you have really high intensity rain events, those can also drown colonies. So we wanted to consider that as well, thinking about how precipitation might change in the future and whether that could be an impactful source of stress for the species. So both from the temperature variables, there's a whole lot of them here, and all these potential stressors of drought and precipitation, coupled with land cover types like forest area, shrubland area, grassland development. We included all of these into a large analysis. I'm not going to talk a lot about the methods, the analytical methods we used in our study, but I wanted to just kind of give you one slide in case there's any statistical nerds out there like myself that are interested in the modeling aspect, the really fine details. So we used the Bayesian model, hierarchical occupancy model. Again, occupancy being we're measuring how likely it is that a species is present or absent from a particular location and what could drive that presence or absence. We used a little under 14,500 surveys that were conducted over 23 years. Again, we had many partners that helped provide data. There's also a large database called the Bumblebees in North American database that is a sort of collation of survey information, museum records across the country that spans over 100 years of data. So we looked at a little snapshot from 1998 to 2020. And the other thing I'll say about these types of models that we run is the really unique and important part is that it allows us to separate out what I like to refer to as the ecological process from the observation process. So the ecological process is what we're interested in. Say, how does temperature drive the occupancy of a species or the presence of a species? From our as surveyors or scientists, our inability to accurately count bees when we're on the landscape. So we go do a survey, we're walking around, we might miss a species that's present. It might be there, but we don't see it. Or we might miscount how many there are. And so with these types of models, we're actually able to correct for that error from our observation error and have more accurate assessments in our ecological process. We're better able to understand those factors by correcting for the observation error. So I'm going to jump right into some results now. So we found a really strong negative effect of one temperature variable in particular, and that was increasing temperature during the warmest quarter, which typically is the summer across North America. This figure here is showing that relationship with occupancy for this variable. So on the x-axis, we have temperature warmest quarter in degrees Celsius, and then the predicted occupancy. And so what this relationship shows is that decline in occupancy as you increase temperature during the summertime. And I translated that to Fahrenheit here in those associated occupancy values. So you can kind of see that range, that once we start to reach an average temperature of 90 degrees or so, the species is fairly absent from the landscape in those areas where it's quite warm. Where it's cooler and where the average doesn't reach that high of temperatures, it's still fairly common. So that's just one slice of the puzzle of what stressors or how they're influencing the species. But we found a large negative effect there for temperature, particularly in the summertime. So looking at drought, we also found a strong negative effect of two measures of drought. One being how many years of drought in a row have occurred over the last 5 years. So the more consecutive years of drought you have, the less likely the species is to be present. Becoming fairly popular news lately. We're having multiple years in a row of drought, more often than not. And then also how severe was the prior year's drought? How dry or wet was it in the prior year? And so the more dry the prior year, the worse the next year is for the species. And so drought can have direct impacts on bumblebees by causing mortality due to lack of water and heat stress, lack of food when your flowering resources dry up. And so when you take those two in tandem, like temperature can also really synergize with drought, with lack of precipitation and cause more extreme droughts. Temperature was the strongest effect, but then drought was also our secondary influence happening between our different climate-related variables. Something else that came out as very important in our model was the importance of forest edge habitat. And so when I talk about forest edge, what we're talking about is the space that sort of the matrix within forests that creates open areas. So here's a photo from outside of where I live, looking over the Missoula Valley. And this species tends to be more present in areas where you have openings in your forests rather than really dense parts of the forest. They like to live along the edge, so to speak. And this allows them, we're hypothesizing, to move between different microclimates. So to better regulate temperature when you have abilities to go in and out of shade, but also to have access to floral resources that are more prevalent in those open areas. In really dense forests, when you have high canopy cover, you don't get a lot of growth on the ground, and so you have less flowers available. And so those gaps are becoming, or at least were identified as somewhat increasingly important for the species. So when we take these different factors, both our temperature effects, the drought effects, and then the land cover features that we find to be most beneficial for the species, we then can start to build spatial maps to look at their presence across the landscape. And so here are two maps of occupancy from 1998 and from 2020, showing the decline and contraction of the range of the species and how prevalent it was across the Western US. So again, occupancy ranges from 0 to 1, 0 being rare or absent even, and then 1 being common or likely. And so historically, you can see fairly common, especially in the mountainous regions, which makes sense given what we've learned about temperature and forest edge habitat. But we'd also see it, still somewhat common out in the plains and the shrubland areas of the Great Basin, and down into the south, high desert, drier coniferous forests. Moving forward, we see a large decline along the West Coast and also in the south here. We'll contextualize that a little bit more on the next slide. So we focus a little bit more on regional trends. So some of the largest percent declines occur along the West Coast and the Cascades and the Sierras, the coastal forests, floral, I'm thinking floral flowers, the coastal forests of Oregon, and then interior California, which would be like your Mediterranean region or Central Valley. A lot of agriculture in there. We see some strongholds. The greater Yellowstone ecosystem appears to be a stronghold for this species given its climate makeup and elevation, forest cover. We only observed a 15% decline in this ecoregion. That sounds small though, and when you put it in context of like what is considered vulnerable versus endangered, a 30% decline is considered vulnerable by the IUCN criteria for species. Once you hit 50%, now we're talking being in the level of decline that would constitute an endangered species. So we're seeing surpassing those thresholds for the IUCN criteria along the West Coast and in the South, certainly, and getting close to the vulnerable status in some of the more interior regions. I'm gonna move a little bit closer to New Mexico for you folks down south. Again, reminding occupancy here, what that means. So the historical range for occidentalis is mostly kind of on a diagonal east to west. This portion is what we would consider outside the historical range. This is a little bit more desert, a little bit drier for it. I put Los Alamos here just for some context. Some places you might be familiar with though, that you see some of these higher occupancy areas, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, open coniferous forest with the kind of habitat that we've been talking about the species preferring, having those open grasslands within a forest matrix. You also see a little high point in the west there, Mount Taylor and the Zuni Mountains, and then the Gila Forest down south, which is a little higher elevation, not as hot as some of the lowland areas. But you can also see here where you have our lower elevation where the species is low probability of being present. So we've found fairly strong evidence of negative effects of temperature, negative effects of drought, sort of determining the importance of different habitat features. One aspect that you're probably wondering that I mentioned about earlier is pesticides, and how could that be influencing the species across its range? And so we also did a subset analysis on a much shorter time period, and we can talk about why that might be if there's questions. It has to do with the availability of pesticide data. But we wanted to compare a variety of different pesticides, both insecticides, which could be directly impacting the species through direct mortality, but also herbicides, which could be removing resources from the environment, as well as fungicides, which some evidence suggests that there might be an interaction between fungicides applied onto crops in the presence of that fungal parasite that we talked about earlier, the Nosema parasite. And we found fairly strong evidence of a negative response to neonicotinoids. We looked at, I think, 12 or 13 different types of combinations of insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, and only neonicotinoids came out as like the most influential type of pesticide. And so when we model areas with no neonicotinoids applied based on crop data, we find an average occupancy of about 0.61. And then in those areas where you have an application of neonicotinoids, it's about half of that, maybe a little bit more than half. We also discovered that as you increase the amount of neonicotinoids on the landscape, the application rate, as that increases, we see a decline in the occupancy of the species. So it's not just the presence absence of the pesticide, there's also a response to the amount applied. And then to contextualize this for the trends that we saw, when we look at the places where we see our larger declines in the south and in the west, and up here in the eastern part of Washington, there's a lot of crops grown there. We start to see these areas also had some of the higher amounts of pesticides being applied, on average per acre of crop or per hectare of crop. So this heat map, choropleth map of different regions that we assessed, showing increasing amounts of neonicotinoids applied kilograms per hectare. The darker red means there's more being applied. We're specifically talking about crop acreage. So how much is applied on the acres of crop specifically. So the story starts to build out more where we have these multiple pathways of stressors that are influencing the decline of the species, both across space and through time. We have the presence of the pathogen, the fungal pathogen, in the late 90s, early 2000s. We have the presence of neonicotinoids on the landscape. They're not applied heavily across the entire West, but they're applied in certain areas. And then you have the added stress of temperature and precipitation on top of that, kind of culminating into multiple avenues for decline for the species. And so the next steps to help inform the decision process. So we're conducting the science, Fish and Wildlife, different agency makes those determinations about the endangered status of the species, but the research we're doing is provided to them to make those decisions. But part of the next steps, in addition to sort of determining what is driving these declines, is to look forward. And that can be really challenging. So how do we choose different climate projections to look forward into the future and try to project trends for the species moving forward? So this figure is just showing a whole bunch of different climate models. These are these names here. These are all sorts of climate models. And I'm just showing you this to show how geographically and how both geographically and in intensity, different climate models provide you with different outcomes into the future. So this first group is precipitation. Then we have mean daily maximum temperature, mean daily minimum temperature, and they're showing them by seasons. But if you just look down one row, you can see how they vary across space, or down one column, I should say. Mainly to point out that it's kind of challenging to look across all these different models and start to think about which ones are the ones you want to pick. And so we used a fairly handy tool. It's the Maca Climate Toolbox. These are methods that allow us to look at the average change in both precipitation, which is along the x-axis here, and the change in temperature, which is along the y-axis. We select models that cover a range of potential projected changes based on the results from the occupancy analysis that I mentioned. So we know that temperature had the strongest effect. That was negative. So when you have positive change in summer temperature, we picked that highest one there to be the worst case scenario. And then you can imagine in an intermediate scenario, maybe a best case scenario with the least amount of warming, but some increase in precipitation. This one you could think of maybe as the least change, which is closest to no change in temperature and precipitation. And so we're beginning to evaluate a range of scenarios from a variety of climate models and emissions projections to start to think about how this species may be present or not into the future. So if we take the information from that, and this is just one of many potential scenarios, but I thought I could show you. This is one based on a specific climate model that shows about a 6.6 degrees Celsius increase by 2050, I should say the 2050s, or that 10-year period. And you can see the projected change from there, from where we were in 2020. Doesn't look great for the persistence of the species moving forward, but again, one of many potential scenarios, and we have to view the range of different scenarios because these are uncertain models, right? We're looking into the future. We don't have perfect knowledge of how things may be in the next 30 years. So that's what we're working on now, is looking into the future, trying to make projections and I don't know, identify areas that have higher resilience than others. Think about how we could direct conservation resources to have the biggest impact for conservation of this species and many others. So I'm going to do a quick review of results and then show you a few other things I think are pretty interesting. So we found fairly large range-wide declines, 1998 to 2020, which aligns with previous research on the same species at both localized studies and then more broadly. Large negative effects of increasing temperature and drought, both how many years of drought, but also how severe those drought are. And we found evidence of negative impact of pesticide uses, particularly neonicotinoids, and that increasing that application rate of those pesticides had a more negative effect the more that there were on the landscape. You might be thinking about other potential potential stressors, pathogens. We can't really measure that. We don't have the information or data to measure that at the scale of the range of the species. And certainly other factors that could influence localized population continuity, like grazing, fire, certainly. Those are things that we're still working out. And oftentimes it's because we don't have the data to address those questions. The species does exist in Canada, and so we're interested in learning more about population trends in Canada. It's a different landscape up there, different climate. Whether that could be a stronghold in the future for the species is something we're still interested in. Canada is a large landmass. We don't have a lot of data that kind of covers the range of the species up there, but that's something we're working on with partners in British Columbia and Alberta. So, not to be in on a depressing note, I wanted to talk about ways that you can kind of help in your own backyard. I'm sure many of you are aware gardening with native plants is really important, both from an economic or ecosystem standpoint, but also from pollinator standpoint. For bumblebees, it's, we're talking about this life cycle. It's really important to think about how we can provide blooms or flowers throughout the year. So planting different types of species that may bloom in the spring and then in the summer, or have some that bloom year round. Of course, the evidence shows that pesticides have a big impact on pollinators, and so limiting the use of those in your backyard would be better than not for the pollinators. For bumblebees, also in particular, leaving litter and woody debris is great for bumblebee nesting. So this is a bumblebee here searching for a nest site, looking around in some leaves and plant matter, and this is the queen down in an early burrow, an early nest site. So if you leave a portion of your yard, a corner along a fence line or something that has that woody debris, that would be beneficial for bumblebee queens that are looking to find nest sites, and not disturbing those then until the following spring after queens have emerged. If you're interested and want to learn more about bumblebees of Western US, really Western North America, there's about 46, 47 species in North America. This book covers a good portion of those that occur in the Western US. You can find both identification guides here and phenology tables that show you when to expect certain casts from those different species to be out in the landscape. This can be freely downloaded. If you search bumblebees Western US, you'll find it as a resource from the Forest Service. I think the Xerces Society also has it posted on their webpage. And to make another plug for Xerces Society, because we have a lot of partners with them, I wanted to mention bumblebeewatch.org, which they collaborate with Xerces Society too, I believe. And this is a citizen science opportunity that you can sign up for and go out on the landscape and take photos of bumblebees. And then scientists like myself are able to use that data and inform the analyses that we've been doing. So it's really important, and we really value the community scientists that are out there to provide that extra data. So thank you to any of you that have been collecting that data. And with that, I just want to thank my collaborators at USGS and Fish and Wildlife Service and elsewhere that have been really pivotal in providing the information and support, both from data, from bee data, but also pesticide information, climate data. and the like. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, awesome. Thank you for that. That was excellent. Okay, so yes, from Barbara, this is the
Nosema? Yeah.
Nosema fungus, the same as the one that is widely sold for grasshopper control.
No, it's a different one. And it's one that was original. I think the history is that it occurred in some of the stocks that were used for the cultivated stocks of pollinators. I'm blanking on the species now, but I know it's a fungus that's specific for bumblebees. It's actually changed its name to Veramorpha, or they just redid the genus on it. So it's possible that there's that other fungus is of the same genus, or historically the same genus, but I don't believe it's the same one from the used for control for grasshoppers. No.
Awesome, thank you. And then I have a question personally, which is, this is part of the sort of getting this insect as considering it endangered. What are like the next steps in that process?
Yeah. Yeah. So I shouldn't say we, because the Fish and Wildlife Service is undergoing their species status assessment for the species. So there's an original petitioning. Anybody can petition Fish and Wildlife to say, we think there's enough evidence for the species to be considered for listing. They do a short finding where they investigate that petition and they say it warrants further investigation. And then it moves on to where it's at now, where we do a much more in-depth analysis. My agency, USGS, often partners with Fish and Wildlife Service to conduct some of those analyses. And so we're able to provide them with the types of stuff that I talked about today. They're writing their reports right now, and that gets then passed on to the folks higher up in Fish and Wildlife Service that will make the ultimate determination for the species. So I don't know how to really define it in terms of steps, but we're kind of in the halfway point. And that can often take several years to decades for some species, as you hear some of the more charismatic, bigger ones, wolverines, grizzly bears, those kinds of things, kind of that's a much longer process. I think for the bumblebees, I can't say exactly, but I think we're in year 2 or 3 now. I don't know how long out it will be though.
Okay, awesome. So we do have another question coming in. Your slide mentioned Bumblebee Watch availability on iPad and iPhone, but I noticed that it's in the Google Play Store as well for Android users.
Oh,
yes.
Perfect. Awesome.
That is great.
I'll have to get an updated slide image for that then. I don't know about the Android people.
Right. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so then I have another question about, once it is considered an endangered species, what then?
I mean, that's a great question, right? What then? There's certainly regulatory and legal aspects then for that, protections for the species. Folks that are involved in management, conservation, action will have more authority to make decisions about what kind of actions would be necessary to conserve the species. I don't know the answer though. I think we're kind of in newer territory for a species that occurs across such a large range. Hopefully, if protections were put into place, you would see the species bounce back. I mean, that's the ultimate goal.
Sure.
But there's no known like specific force actions that would take place. But there's a whole, I guess, legal side to it that would come into play. But my background here is providing the science for the folks that make those ultimate decisions in the end.
Certainly. Awesome. Well, I think that we'll give it a second for questions. That was a lot of great information. I'm sure people are like soaking it in. As a reminder,
there's a lot there. Yep.
Yeah, there is. This has been recorded, so we will be posting it on YouTube. If anyone in the audience would like to share it with friends or rewatch it, I do think this is a really important issue. So, and I'm sure obviously Will does as well. So yeah. Well,
It's
awesome.
certainly not like a simple story. I mean, there's a lot of different aspects taking place, both as I was mentioning through time and across space, and these different factors that can influence a species. And we really think, I mentioned silent alarms early on because we're thinking about this species too, in particular as a generalist that still occurs across much of the country. If that species is declining, what does that mean about rare species that we know less about, that we don't often observe out in the wild, that we might have collections of, museum collections of, but we don't have like consistent study of, which, is starting to open a lot more doors to think about pollinator communities broadly, and excited to see where it goes. Not so excited for the outcome sometimes, but excited for pursuing the questions.
I think that's all the questions we have. So I want to say thank you so much, Will, for sharing your research and your knowledge. It was incredible. I'm glad that you can join us this evening.
Of course.
Yeah, and also to everyone that joined us via Zoom, thank you for joining us. And again, this will be on YouTube in the next couple of weeks. Please look for it. And if you have any questions, I can relay them to Will if they pop up after this. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. And Will, thank you so much, really.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, and appreciate everybody in the audience that came to listen.
Yeah, definitely. And you're getting a lot of thank yous right now. So that's good.
I see it. Appreciate it, everybody.
Awesome. Have a good evening.
All right, take care.
Bye.